It began like a storm. No one was prepared for a sudden, roaring force that swept across Europe with such speed that even seasoned generals and political leaders found themselves staring in disbelief. In the autumn of 1939, when the first German tanks rolled across the Polish border, the world witnessed a kind of war it had never seen before. What Germany unleashed was not just a military campaign, it was a shockwave that shattered the illusion of peace that Europe had desperately tried to hold onto since the end of World War I. And at the center of this storm stood Adolf Hitler, the man whose ambition, confidence, and ruthless strategy briefly made Germany appear unstoppable. Germany's rise did not begin on the battlefield. It began years earlier, inside a broken, humiliated nation struggling to stand after the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty had crushed the German spirit, stripped its territories, limited its army, and imposed crushing reparations. The global Great Depression added more fuel to the fire. German citizens faced unemployment, poverty, and political chaos. When Hitler emerged promising jobs, pride, unity, and revenge, people listened. Germany wanted someone who could restore the lost glory, and Hitler fit perfectly into the space created by frustration and desperation. By the late 1930s, Hitler had secretly rebuilt the army, violated treaty restrictions, and brought back military pride. German engineers created advanced tanks, aircraft, and communication systems. Everything was being prepared for one objective, a new kind of war that Germany believed no enemy could resist. This strategy was called blitzkrieg, meaning lightning war. Instead of slow, grinding trench battles like in World War I, blitzkrieg focused on speed, coordination, and sheer shock value. Tanks would pierce enemy lines, aircraft would bomb communication networks, and infantry would sweep through like a wave before the enemy even recovered their balance. Blitzkrieg was not just an attack, it was psychological warfare designed to break the enemy's spirit even before breaking their defenses. On September 1, 1939, when Blitzkrieg struck Poland, it proved devastatingly effective. Within days, German forces had penetrated deep into the country, destroying Polish resistance. Roads, railways, bridges, everything that connected the Polish army was torn apart. Civilians watched helplessly as German tanks thundered past them while aircraft shrieked through the sky. By the time the world realized the scale of Germany's new warfare style, Poland had already begun to crumble. The campaign lasted only weeks. The world was shocked. Poland had expected at least months of fighting. Instead, Germany delivered a message: this was not World War I, and Germany was not the weak nation it once had been. Within months Germany turned north and struck Denmark and Norway. Both campaigns were swift and decisive. Denmark fell in a matter of hours, one of the shortest military operations in history. Norway, despite some resistance and Allied involvement, eventually fell, giving Germany control of vital ports and supply routes. Hitler's confidence grew with every victory. His generals were convinced that Germany was on a winning streak unlike anything Europe had witnessed in decades. Then came 1940, the year that changed everything. Germany launched its Western offensive, targeting Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and eventually France. Once again Blitzkrieg proved unstoppable. The speed of German tanks stunned observers. Entire Allied divisions were trapped or pushed aside before they could regroup. Cities like Rotterdam witnessed heavy bombings that forced quick surrender. Belgium collapsed in days, the Netherlands shortly after, and Luxembourg almost instantly. The world watched Germany sweep across the map as if boundaries were merely ink on paper. But the greatest shock came when France fell. France was considered one of the strongest military powers in the world, backed by heavy fortifications like the Maginot Line. Yet Germany bypassed these defenses by moving through the Ardennes forest, an area the French believed tanks could not cross. Within 6 weeks, France surrendered. Paris, one of Europe's greatest cities, had fallen without a long battle. German soldiers marched under the Arc de Triomphe as Hitler celebrated what he called his greatest victory. He even forced French officials to sign the surrender documents in the same railway carriage where Germany had signed its humiliation in 1918. It was Hitler's moment of revenge, and the world understood. Germany now dominated the European continent. With France defeated, Hitler expected Britain to negotiate peace. But Britain refused. This led to the Battle of Britain, the first major air battle in history. German bombers targeted British factories, airfields, and cities. Night after night, London and other cities faced massive air raids. Yet Britain did not fall. Radar technology, the bravery of RAF pilots, and strong leadership ensured survival. This was the first time Germany's unstoppable image cracked just a little. Still, by the end of 1940, Germany seemed nearly invincible. Almost all of Europe from Norway to the Balkans was either occupied by Germany or aligned with it. Hitler had become the most feared man in the world. Newspapers across the globe carried headlines describing Germany's rapid victories. Political analysts warned that if something wasn't done soon, Germany would control Europe entirely. But beneath this triumph lay hidden weaknesses that would eventually destroy the German war machine. Blitzkrieg was brilliant, but it depended on resources, fuel, and short campaigns. Germany needed quick victories to maintain momentum. Any long, drawn-out war would expose its limited supplies and industrial weaknesses compared to giants like the United States and the Soviet Union. Yet Hitler, blinded by success, did not see the danger. His growing arrogance made him believe Germany could defeat any nation, no matter the size. He had won too quickly, too easily. Early victories became intoxicating, and this overconfidence pushed him toward decisions that would eventually break the backbone of the German military. As 1941 approached, Germany stood at the peak of its power, controlling most of Europe and terrifying the rest. What no one realized at the time, not even Hitler, was that the same lightning speed that had lifted Germany to this height would soon drag it downward just as fast. Blitzkrieg had made Germany powerful, but it had also created illusions. And it would be the shattering of these illusions that would signal the beginning of Germany's downfall. Operation Barbarossa, the gamble that broke Germany, 1,000 to 1,100 words. It was early summer in 1941, and across Europe there was a strange, uneasy silence like the stillness before a colossal storm. Germany had already crushed the Western powers, dominated the North, and secured much of Central Europe. Newspapers across the continent declared one thing: Hitler's Germany had become a force no one could resist. Yet behind closed doors in Berlin, plans were underway for a move so bold, so enormous, that even Hitler's top commanders whispered concerns. Hitler was preparing to invade the Soviet Union, launching what would become the largest military operation in human history. And on June 22, 1941, Germany crossed a line from which it could never return. Operation Barbarossa was more than a military offensive, it was Hitler's obsession. He saw the Soviet Union not just as an enemy but as a gigantic prize. Its vast land, endless resources, and ideological opposition made it a target he believed Germany had to crush in order to rule the world. Hitler convinced himself that the Soviet Union would collapse like a house of cards the moment the German army struck. Many officers argued that the war against Britain was not yet completed, and opening another massive front was dangerous. But Hitler's confidence had swelled so much from earlier victories that he ignored every warning. he was certain Russia would fall within months. As dawn broke on that fateful June morning, 3 million German soldiers surged across a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Tanks rolled through fields, aircraft rose in waves, and artillery thundered across the forests. The Soviet border defenses were overwhelmed instantly. Communication broke down, commanders disappeared, and Soviet units found themselves cut off and surrounded within hours. Entire divisions collapsed before understanding what had happened. The scale of the attack stunned the world. Germany wasn't simply invading, it was attempting to obliterate a nation. In the first few weeks, everything seemed to support Hitler's confidence. German troops advanced deep into Soviet territory at a pace that shocked even their own leadership. Towns fell rapidly, millions of Soviet soldiers were captured, and German newspapers declared it another unstoppable victory. But underneath this rapid progress, cracks were already forming, cracks that Germany would only notice when it was too late. The first problem was geography. The Soviet Union was not like France or Belgium. Its size was overwhelming, almost unimaginable to the German units advancing eastward. Every mile gained stretched German supply lines thinner and thinner. Fuel trucks lagged behind, ammunition arrived late, and troops found themselves waiting days for essential supplies. Blitzkrieg depended on speed, but the vastness of Soviet territory absorbed that speed like a sponge. Then came the weather. The late summer heat turned the roads into dust and choked engines, while sudden storms transformed dirt paths into sticky mud. Trucks got stuck, horses collapsed, and tanks slowed down. The German army, built for quick, decisive battles, was now being dragged into a landscape that fought back with every inch. As German forces advanced, the Soviet Union revealed another unexpected strength, the ability to absorb unimaginable losses and still continue fighting. Stalin ordered factories in the west to be dismantled and transported thousands of kilometers to the Ural Mountains, far beyond the reach of German aircraft. Within months, these factories were reassembled and producing tanks, guns, and aircraft at a pace that stunned German intelligence. Germany had assumed the Soviets would run out of equipment. Instead, the Soviets were building more than ever. Despite these challenges, the German advance continued, and by autumn, they were at the gates of Moscow. But the weather had already begun to shift. Temperatures dropped rapidly, and German soldiers expecting a short campaign had not been given winter clothing. Boots cracked in the cold, weapons jammed, and engines refused to start. The bitter Russian winter struck with unforgiving force. Soldiers tried wrapping themselves in blankets, newspapers, anything that could block the cold, but nothing worked. Frostbite spread through the ranks, and morale began to crumble. While the Germans struggled to survive the weather, the Soviets prepared a massive counterattack. Reinforcements poured in from Siberia, troops trained to fight in freezing conditions and equipped with proper winter gear. As snow covered the fields around Moscow, Soviet forces launched a sudden, intense assault that pushed the exhausted Germans back. Hitler refused to allow his forces to retreat, even when logic demanded it. Divisions were nearly erased as they stood their ground against relentless Soviet pressure. What was meant to be a swift victory had turned into a frozen nightmare. But the true turning point came in 1942, when Hitler set his sights on the city of Stalingrad. It was not a strategically essential target, yet Hitler wanted it for symbolic reasons. It carried Stalin's name. He believed capturing it would break Soviet morale. Instead, the battle became one of the most brutal in human history. For months, German and Soviet troops fought street by street, building by building, room by room. The city turned into a graveyard of rubble and twisted metal. German soldiers found themselves trapped in a hostile maze while Soviet snipers, hidden in the ruins, picked them off one by one. As winter returned, the Soviets launched a massive encirclement operation. The entire German Sixth Army was surrounded. Hitler ordered them to fight to the last man, refusing evacuation. When their food ran out, they ate horses. When fuel ran out, tanks froze in place. When ammunition ran out, they fought with desperation. In February 1943, the remaining survivors surrendered. It was a defeat so devastating that even German citizens felt the shock. The failure of Barbarossa began a slow but irreversible collapse. Germany had underestimated everything: the Soviet climate, the Soviet capacity to rebuild, the size of the territory, and the resilience of its people. The war on the Eastern Front was not just a military struggle, it was a battle of endurance, and Germany had entered it without understanding what it would demand. By the end of 1943, the illusion of German invincibility had shattered. What began as a confident gamble had become a bleeding wound that drained Germany's strength day after day. The Eastern Front consumed troops, fuel, equipment, and morale at a pace Germany could not sustain. The very campaign that was supposed to secure Germany's dominance had instead engineered its downfall. Operation Barbarossa had not just failed, it had doomed Germany to a war it could no longer win. When the giants awoke, America enters the war and Germany starts to crack, 1,000 to 1,100 words. For 2 years, Germany had moved across Europe like a force from another world, fast, confident, and terrifyingly efficient. But in late 1941, the global balance shifted in a way that few in Berlin had anticipated. Somewhere across the ocean, far from the burning cities of Europe and the frozen battlefields of the East, an industrial giant was waking up. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States entered the war, and with that single step, Germany's fate quietly began to change. Even before American soldiers reached European shores, the impact of its entry rippled through the strategy rooms of Berlin. Hitler, driven by ideology and rage, declared war on the United States without considering what he was inviting into the conflict. The mistake was immense. Germany, a country already straining its resources on multiple fronts, had effectively challenged the world's largest economy. Inside American factories, the transformation was immediate. Assembly lines that once produced cars began rolling out tanks. Shipyards worked around the clock, welding the steel frames of new warships that would soon cross the Atlantic. Aircraft plants doubled their production speed until they surpassed every other nation combined. Newspapers in Washington reported figures so astonishing that Europeans considered them unbelievable. The United States was not preparing for a limited engagement, it was preparing for a full-scale industrial war. Germany could not have faced a more dangerous opponent. This industrial surge soon flowed across the oceans. Britain, which had been struggling alone, suddenly found itself supplied with thousands of aircraft engines, trucks, artillery pieces, and mountains of ammunition. The Soviet Union, fighting desperately on the Eastern Front, received American jeeps, locomotives, raw materials, and canned food that kept their armies moving. Germany had hoped these nations would collapse under pressure, but instead, they were now reinforced with resources that Germany could not match even in its best days. It was as if the war had reset, except now Germany was facing enemies with bottomless supply lines. Yet the most visible change came in the skies over Europe. By 1943, American bombers joined British aircraft to pound German industrial centers day and night. The skyline of Germany transformed into a battleground of roaring engines and black smoke. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, Essen, and Berlin became targets in a relentless campaign to cripple the German war machine. Factories that had once buzzed with activity now lay in ruins, their roofs collapsed, machinery twisted and burned. Railroad yards and fuel depots were turned into scorched wastelands. Every bomb drop meant another delay in tank production, another shortage of aircraft parts, another train that would never reach the front. While factories were being destroyed, another disaster brewed beneath the surface: Germany's fuel crisis. Tanks, trucks, submarines, and aircraft all ran on fuel, and Germany's supply was frighteningly small. Unlike the United States or the Soviet Union, Germany had no vast natural oil reserves. It relied heavily on the oil fields of Romania, which soon became prime targets for Allied bombing. When those fields were attacked, flames leapt into the sky like burning towers, marking the beginning of Germany's slow suffocation. Inside the German High Command, the situation became increasingly tense. Reports arriving from the front lines painted a picture of demoralized troops fighting with outdated or damaged equipment. Panzer divisions that once roared across Europe now rationed fuel so strictly that tanks were sometimes moved only at night to save every possible drop. Aircraft stood idle at airfields, not because there were no pilots but because there wasn't enough aviation fuel to lift them into the sky. As Allied bombers grew more frequent, German fighters were forced to stay grounded, watching helplessly as their cities burned. Meanwhile, the Battle of the Atlantic was turning against Germany. In the earlier years of the war, German U-boats had hunted Allied ships with ruthless success, threatening to starve Britain into submission. But by 1943, Allied technology, radar, sonar, long-range aircraft had matured to the point where U-boats became vulnerable. The hunters were turning into the hunted. Convoys that once traveled in fear now moved with powerful escort ships, ready to strike at any submarine that crossed their path. The Atlantic, which Germany had once dominated, became a graveyard for its submarines, each sinking, tightening the Allies' hold over the world's supply routes. At home, German citizens felt the war closing in. Blackout curtains could no longer hide the glow of burning neighborhoods. Streets once filled with families were now marked by rubble. Trains carrying workers to factories were redirected to transport the wounded or evacuate survivors. Food, which had been rationed early in the war, grew scarcer. Winter brought harsh shortages, and stores displayed empty shelves where bread and meat once sat. The illusion of certainty that Hitler had projected in the early years was vanishing. People whispered in shelters during air raids, wondering when the end would come and whether their sons on the front lines would ever return. Inside Hitler's inner circle, frustration turned into paranoia. He blamed generals for defeats, scientists for delays, and factory workers for inefficiency. Meetings grew tense. Plans were made and scrapped within hours. Hitler insisted that numerical weapons, rockets, jet fighters, super tanks would reverse the tide. But these machines required skills, resources, and time that Germany no longer possessed. Many remained prototypes or were produced in such small numbers that they made no difference. Meanwhile, Allied strength grew every month. By 1944, American troops were arriving in Europe in such large numbers that German commanders privately admitted they could not be stopped forever. Germany's armies were trapped in a slow retreat on the Eastern Front and facing rising pressure in Italy. Everyone could see what was coming next: an Allied invasion of Western Europe. German soldiers dug into bunkers along the Atlantic coast, aware that sooner or later, the storm would arrive. When it finally came on June 6, 1944, D-Day, it confirmed what German officers had feared. The Allies had built a force so strong that even the formidable coastal defenses could not stop it. As American, British, and Canadian troops broke through, Germany was left fighting an enemy it could no longer outproduce, outnumber, or outmaneuver. From that moment on, Germany was trapped between two massive forces, the Soviet Union pressing from the east and the Western Allies pushing from the west. For the German soldier, the war now felt like an endless retreat. For German citizens, it became a struggle to survive. For Hitler, it turned into a nightmare of collapsing dreams and shrinking maps. The arrival of the United States had done more than add another enemy, it had changed the scale of the war. Germany, once the aggressor with unstoppable momentum, was now a nation fighting against time, resources, and overwhelming odds. And as factories fell silent, oil ran dry, cities burned, and armies shrank, it became clear, Germany's early victories had led it into a battle it was never prepared to finish. The collapse, Germany's final descent, 1,000 to 1,100 words. By early 1945, a strange quietness filled many German cities, not the peaceful silence of a country at rest, but the exhausted pause of a nation stretched beyond its breaking point. Streets once alive with marching boots and victory parades were now marked by shattered buildings, burnt-out vehicles, and long lines of civilians searching for essentials that had become almost impossible to find. Germany, once the roaring engine of conquest, was facing the cold reality of defeat. Every passing week tightened the news. Every new headline hinted that the end was no longer a distant threat, it was knocking at the door. Inside Hitler's bunker in Berlin, the atmosphere had changed from the confident thunder of earlier years to a suffocating mixture of denial and desperation. Reports from the front arrived like a series of blows, Soviet forces pushing deeper from the east, Allied troops advancing from the west, and German units surrendering or collapsing under pressure. Generals who once admired Hitler's instincts now watched in frustration as he dismissed their advice, replaced seasoned commanders, and issued orders disconnected from the battlefield. His world had shrunk from a continent he once dreamed of ruling to a few dimly lit rooms beneath the ruined capital. Outside that bunker, the military situation was deteriorating rapidly. German divisions were no longer cohesive fighting machines, they were fragmented groups of exhausted soldiers, teenagers pulled from schools, and elderly men drafted far past the age of war. Weapons were scarce, ammunition limited, and vehicles frequently abandoned because there was no fuel to operate them. When Allied and Soviet intelligence studied German movements in early 1945, they noted something alarming: many of the once powerful panzer units had more men than working tanks. Germany's war machine, which had terrified Europe in 1939, was now being held together by sheer willpower and fading propaganda. On the Western Front, Allied forces pressed forward with relentless efficiency. After breaking through in France, they entered Belgium, Luxembourg, and the western regions of Germany. Town after town fell, often after brutal street fighting. German commanders struggled to slow their advance, but by then the imbalance in strength was overwhelming. German soldiers dug trenches, set up barricades, and laid mines, yet the waves of Allied tanks, artillery, and infantry could not be stopped. As winter turned to spring, the Rhine River, the natural barrier many believed would protect Germany, was crossed by Allied forces with astonishing speed. Bridges built in secret, pontoon crossings, and daring operations made it clear that nothing could halt the Allied momentum. In the south, another front was collapsing. Italy, once a proud Axis partner, had changed sides long ago, and now Allied troops were pushing through northern Italy into German-held territory. German units stationed there were trapped between advancing armies, unable to retreat or receive reinforcements. Cities like Milan and Turin erupted in uprisings, leaving German forces isolated and vulnerable. It was becoming painfully clear, Germany was being squeezed from all directions. Yet none of this compared to the fury of the Eastern Front, where the Soviet army advanced with a determination shaped by years of suffering. Every step toward Berlin carried the weight of millions of lost soldiers and civilians. By early 1945, Soviet forces were approaching the Oder River, only a short distance from the German capital. Villages emptied as civilians fled westward, hoping to escape the vengeance they feared the Soviets would bring. Roads became choked with refugees, carts loaded with children, old people, and whatever belongings they could salvage. It was a mass movement born not out of choice but of terror. German commanders attempted to organize defensive lines along rivers and remaining strongholds, but the Soviet advance came too fast. Cities like Königsberg, Breslau, and Danzig fell after intense battles that left entire neighborhoods in ruins. What the Soviets could not overpower with tanks, they overwhelmed with artillery. German units, already thin and exhausted, were forced into chaotic retreats. Desertions increased, and officers struggled to maintain discipline as panic spread. Back in Berlin, Hitler refused to leave the city. He insisted that a massive counterattack was coming, that new divisions were forming, and that Germany would soon push back the invaders. Generals knew these claims were fantasies. Maps laid out on bunker tables showed nothing but shrinking lines and surrounded units. Hitler's refusal to face reality became one of the final factors that accelerated the collapse. He ordered offensives that no longer made strategic sense, assigned non-existent troops to crucial positions, and demanded sacrifice without acknowledging the hopelessness of the situation. Meanwhile, Germany's civilian population bore the heaviest burden. Food shortages turned daily meals into desperate improvisations. Hospitals overflowed with injured soldiers and civilians wounded during air raids. Schools, churches, and public buildings became makeshift shelters for families who had lost their homes to bombings. Children who once played in parks now spent their afternoons collecting firewood from destroyed houses or hiding in basements during air raid sirens. Newspapers tried to maintain morale, but even carefully controlled articles could not hide the truth. The shadows of fear and exhaustion stretched across every city. As Soviet armies prepared to storm Berlin in April 1945, the city transformed into a scene of chaotic resistance. Hitler Youth members, barely in their teens, were handed rifles and told to defend street corners. Old men who had served in World War I were given helmets that no longer fit and ordered to hold strategic points. German officers moved through the rubble-filled streets, shouting instructions that grew more desperate with each hour. The thunder of Soviet artillery echoed continuously, shaking the ground and sending dust falling from ruined ceilings. Civilians crowded into underground stations, listening to distant explosions that grew closer by the night. The battle for Berlin lasted only a few days, but its intensity was unmatched. Soviet tanks blasted through barricades, infantry stormed buildings room by room, and snipers positioned themselves in shattered windows. German resistance was fierce in pockets, but hopelessness had already seeped into the defense. On April 30, 1945, as Soviet troops encircled the government district, Hitler took his own life in the bunker. His final instructions and final speeches meant nothing now, his empire was collapsing above his head. By May 2, Berlin had fallen. Across Germany, commanders began surrendering one by one. On May 7, in a small schoolhouse in Reims, German representatives signed the unconditional surrender document. The war in Europe was over. The once unstoppable Reich had dissolved into defeat. What remained of Germany in those days was a landscape scarred by conflict and a population unsure of its future. Cities lay in ruins, millions were displaced, and families were torn apart by loss. The collapse had come not in a single moment but through a chain of miscalculations, overconfidence, and catastrophic decisions. Germany had entered the war chasing domination, it ended the war fighting for basic survival. And as the dust settled on a continent reshaped by destruction, one truth became undeniable: the speed and ambition that once brought Germany to the height of power were the same forces that ultimately dragged it to its ruin.